What's up, hobby friends? In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I paint my Ossiarch Bonereapers for Age of Sigmar. The techniques I'm going to be showing you in this tutorial are focused mainly on getting the army painted up quickly and on the tabletop and essentially battle ready. And I say battle ready in the sense that we're going to be using things like drybrushing to get some of the parts of this model done quickly rather than hand blending all of the bone. It's important to recognize that when you're painting an army, especially a large army like Age of Sigmar, you're going to have a lot of models, and then the majority of them are going to be seen from 3 or 4 or 5 feet away on the tabletop. At that distance, you're not going to notice whether something is dry brushed or hand blended meticulously. What you are going to notice are strong color palette choices and good contrast. So that's really what we want to be focusing on when we think through painting these models. And that's what I focused on when I developed this technique, developed this palette, and sort of what I'm thinking through as I'm painting my basic rank and file infantry. Of course, when I do go to paint my characters like Catacross or my Soul Mason, I do take that effort, spend that little time, because those are centerpieces, those are heroes, and I expect that people will want to look at them up close, maybe even pick them up and take a look at them. The recipes for heroes and infantry will be the same. It's more just the approach. I dry brush the infantry in the rank and file, and I hand blend the characters and heroes. This model that we'll be painting today is from the Shadespire box. I've built it stock. I like the sword, and the pose is holding very samurai-esque, and he'll probably sub in as one of my Mortec Guard Hecatos. I've done a head swap, swapping up the Rictus Grin skull from the Bonereapers design for a generic skull from the Games Workshop skull kit. And I've also scratch built a Sashimono or back banner for him using some spare parts I've had lying around from both the Shadespire box and some plastic card for the banner itself. I like the head because it makes it feel like he's wearing a suit of armor. And that combined with sort of the plated look, especially on the shoulder pads and the chest and the back banner, helps to just cement the army with that Japanese narrative or motif that I really want to reinforce. Once the model was built, I just primed it with Vallejo's Surface Primer Black. So this is my current project box for the 2 armies I'm working on. So I have my Necrons on one half. You can basically ignore this. And then we have the paint that we're going to be using to paint my Bonereaper model. I like having all my paints organized in a project box like this because I can basically work through the sequence left to right through all the different parts of the model, and then back to front from base coats all the way through my highlights. To paint the bone, we're going to be using Vallejo's Burnt Umber, Iraqi Sand, and Scale Colors White Sands. We're then going to use the airbrush and apply some glazes with Vallejo's Smoke and Game Air Hex Lichen. We're then going to move on to painting the green parts of the armor. And for that, we're using Scale Colors Deep Blue, Black Forest Green, Irati Green, and Spring Green. For the non-metal gold trim, we're using Games Workshop's Gorkrunter Fur as a base coat. And then we're going to highlight with Scale Colors Resurrection Flush, Sahara Yellow, and Tenaire Yellow. To paint the orange tabards and any sort of bindings and straps, we're going to use Scale Colors African Shadow, Indian Shadow, Kalahari Orange, and then some Games Workshop Contrast Volupus Pink to do some glazes and some washes. To paint the sort of blue steel non-metal blades, we're going to be using Scale Colors Deep Blue, Bearing Blue, Arctic Blue, Heike Yellow, and then AK White. For the Sashimono on the Hecatos, we're going to be using 2 colors for this on top of our African Shadow base, AK Burnt Red and Blood Red. And then on this particular model, there's going to be some stones on the base as well as the crow on the banner, or the raven. So we're going to be using AK's Black, Rubber Black, and Hellbound Flesh. And then to finish off the model, we're going to be using Vallejo's Earth texture. I have the brown earth. This is a colored paste, acrylic based, so you can dilute it and hand paint it with a brush. And then because it's colored, it's basically a 2-in-1 Once this is applied, we'll apply some tufts with Army Painter Winter Tuft, and then we'll finish off with Vallejo's Dark Red Ochre pigments. So we're going to start by painting the biggest area of the model, which is the bone, and we're going to be using our Burnt Umber Iraqi Sand White Sands mix. I'm going to be using a cheap makeup brush for this, and I like this because the bristles are nice and soft, short, and there's a lot of them, which will give us a nice sort of soft, dusty feel for the bone. Artist Opus's brushes are really good for this as well, the dry brush ones, but they are a little expensive. So if you want a decent alternative, I think makeup brushes are an equivalent product. So we're going to start with our Burnt Umber, and we're just going to apply a nice, strong dry brush over all of the bone. And if you get any onto other parts of the model, that's okay. Try and get some of this color onto the non-NMM Gold Trim, anything that you intend to paint gold afterwards. This will give us sort of an initial, almost a brighter value that isn't black, to then apply our Gorgonta fur on top of. When I get to the banner, because I know it is a little fragile, I'm going to be a little gentler with the dry brush. And I'm just making sure that I get a nice coat over anything that's going to be done. When I'm working on a model like a Mortec guard that has a shield, if possible, I try and keep the shield as a separate component, because often the shield hides the entire model and I can't get to the center. So it's nice to be able to work on them separately and then glue it all together afterwards. Once we have our Burnt Umber applied, we're now going to mix in a bit of our Iraqi sand. And we're just going to do a light highlight dry brush, keeping the brush delicately circling across the model. And I'm trying to be very gentle with the way I apply this highlight. I'm focusing my stronger brush strokes on the downward motion and then circling around to lightly catch the edge. The goal is not to do a strong dry brush in the bottom up direction, because otherwise you're going to catch that paint on the undercuts. And if it helps, or if it's easier for you, do downward dry brush strokes. Dry brushing from the direction of your light source, and this way you're only catching the top raised surfaces. And we'll keep dry brushing by mixing in progressive amounts of our Iraqi sand to brighten up the model. Again, be very soft, very gentle with your brush. Try not to load it with too much color, and you'll find you'll have to swap brushes or clean your brush periodically as the paint starts to dry and caked onto the bristles. And you'll notice this when your dry brushing starts to get really streaky and really messy. That's when it's time to clean the brush or swap brushes and try and get back to that soft textured feel. With enough practice with this technique, and if you're going soft enough, you can almost pseudo wet blend it, especially when you're working on a single model or small batches of models like this. as you work your way up to that pure Iraqi sand, try and focus your highlights now on the utmost raised surfaces. Start to now think about getting sort of that shading in there, that contrast between your highlights and your shadows. Don't just autopilot dry brush this color all the way through. Really think through where you're dry brushing your highlights to focus and hone in on those raised surfaces that should be giving those highlights. Once again, just being gentle with that back banner, too much pressure because the only contact points here are in the back here where I've trimmed the spine. So be gentle if you do something like a back banner like this. If you must, use your finger to brace, and that will give you something to help support the banner as you dry brush it. And then from Iraqi sand, we're just going to start mixing in our white sands, focusing our really bright highlights. And for this, I'm going to be concentrating this on the upper half of the model, the skull, the hands, arms, and maybe the hips. For this final highlight of white sands, I'm switching to a fresh dry brush. I'm using my Artist Opus for this just because it is softer and cleaner. The one advantage to these Artist Opus brushes over a cheap makeup brush like this, I've found that the Artist Opus ones are easier to clean. So they do last quite a bit longer. You can maintain the bristles a lot more. So if you can invest the money, I think they're definitely worth it. But I think just in terms of function, makeup brushes work just as well. And then we're just going to do a light dusting of our final white sands highlight on the top of the skull and arms, a little bit of the hips and the hands. With the dry brushing done, I want to do some glazes on the bone with the airbrush. So I'm using Vallejo Smoke and Hex Lichen for this. I've got this loaded into my airbrush in about a 4 parts water, 1 part paint ratio. And then I have my compressor set to about 15 psi, fairly low. I'm using my 2mm needle for this, or 0.2mm. I'm just going to gently spray from underneath. And what I'm looking to do is capture this color into the mid and shadow tones while preserving the highlights. And this is going to help smooth out some of those rougher parts and add a little bit of warmth and color to the bone. And I'll do the same thing with Vallejo's Hex Lichen. This one I've diluted a little bit more, 5 or 6 parts water to 1 part paint, just because the color is so intense. And I don't want it to be too overpowering. I want to be able to build up the color. Once again, spraying from underneath, catching the color in the mid and shadow tones. And what I'm doing is I'm pulling back on the trigger to release a little bit of color, and then releasing to have just air, so I can air dry the wash on the model. And once we're done with the airbrushing, we can go back in by hand and using our Iraqi sand and white sands, just touch up some of the highlights in areas like the face. So the next part of the model we're going to be painting is the green armor. So his chest plate, shoulder plates, the forearm vamp braces, and then if he has a shield, the shield as well, which I'd have on a separate paint handle or sub-assembly. We're going to be using 4 colors. Scale colors dark blue, or deep blue, sorry, black forest green, Arati green, and spring green. And we're essentially doing a blend or progression through these 4 colors. I'm going to start with a base coat of dark sea blue. And I like working on the green armor first before going on the trim because of the way that the armor overlaps. We can be a little bit messy with the blue stage and then go back and neaten up with the trim. On areas like the shoulder pad, make sure that you're getting underneath and getting the undercut where the shoulder pad meets the arm. There, we'll do a highlight with black forest green. Keep in mind where your light source is going to be. I typically illuminate my models all the same 3/4 top down from the front. So for this model. And then especially on the Mortec guard where these armor panels are fairly small, it's a much easier job working through the blends. On something larger like the Mortec guard shields, if you're painting Necropolis Stalkers or a Mortis guard, and then moving up to bigger models like the monsters, like the Harvester, the Crawler, and Kratos, where the armor plates do get a little bigger, you'll want to spend a little more time working on your blends. And from Black Forest Green, we'll mix a 50-50 Black Forest Green or Arati Green intermediary step. After you pull to the back, you're going to want to have your highlight carry less and less because it's going to be darker in the back of the model. And we'll have a stronger green highlight in the front. Also, changing up the direction of your brushstrokes each time you build a layer helps to hide those brushstrokes and smooth up your transitions. And then we're just taking pure erotic green and doing another highlight pass. Now I'm doing one shoulder pad right now to demonstrate the color recipe and technique to you. Normally I would be doing all of the armor on the model at the same time, which would give me sufficient time to paint each highlight step on each armor plate, and by the time I get back to the first, it'll have dried and I can move on to the next highlight step. What I'm having to do right now, because of I'm only painting the one pad, is I'm just having to wait a little bit longer for each layer to dry before I move on to the next. And then from erotic green, we're going to go into spring green. Once again, doing a 50-50 mix of the two. And I'm going to be really concentrating this green on the brightest points. So areas like the top of the forearm gauntlets, the very tip top of the shoulder plates, and then the tops of the shields. I don't want to bring this highlight too far down because this color is, or this color mix is, a little bit desaturated. You start to lose the saturation of the erotic green as you work your way brighter and brighter into the spring green. That's because I think the spring green has a bit of white in the color mix. And then we'll take our pure spring green and do an edge highlight. And then to help smooth up the transitions and deepen some of those shadows, I'm just going to take my dark sea blue, or deep blue, sorry, I keep mixing the colors up, and just doing a glaze over the armor panel, pushing the color into the shadow tone. So depending on the specific model and the weapon that you're painting, you may have to tackle the silver before doing the gold. I'm going to be doing the sword first because of the way that the gold trim on the crossbow guard covers over the blade. So this way, by painting the blade first, I can be sketchier with it, be messier, especially down here, and then correct up again with the trim, much like with the gold and the green armor. So we're starting with a base coat of that scale colored deep blue, which I base coated when I was painting the rest of the green. Don't forget the blade on the background if you have one. And then much like the green, we're highlighting through Baron blue, Arctic blue, Hike yellow, and then white. On this blade, there's two facets on each side. There's the flat, and then there's the cutting edge. What I'm going to be doing is doing the blend purely on the cutting edge here, and we're going to completely ignore the flat. This way, I'm only really blending half of a sword on each side, and we get this high contrast, bright blade with a dark flat panel to really sell that non-monomer. So I'm going to start with a 50-50 mix of Baron blue and dark sea blue, and I'm just going to quickly sketch in approximately how I want the blend to go on the sword, and I'll fudge a couple of brighter spots as I go along the way. Now I'm only going to paint one half of the sword here. You're going to repeat this process for this flat here, but probably in reverse as it curves into shadow. and then right here as well, mirroring the other half of the blade. Now I'm going to be painting this in a sort of flashy tabletop nominal model where I'm not too concerned with hyper accuracy on the lighting. What I'm looking for is high contrast and pop, something that will look good from 4 or 5 feet away and not about how realistic it is. I'm going to keep highlighting up with the bearing blue. And once again, I'm only focusing on the cutting edge. I'm going to ignore this flat part of the blade for now. Now, as I highlight up, you're going to notice that I'm focusing on creating sort of these bands of highlights down the bottom. And that's mainly to reinforce or sell the fact the blade isn't perfectly flat. There's some undulation, I think, from the imperfections in the blade as well as wear and tear from just battle. From pure bearing blue, we're going to start mixing in progressive amounts of Arctic blue. And I'm just bouncing between the two sides because I need to wait for the paint to dry. Much like with the green, as long as you keep changing up the direction of your brushstrokes, as you build up your layers, you're going to hide each sort of messy layer, and you're going to be able to build up your color nice and smoothly. From pure Arctic blue, we can start mixing in a bit of Heike yellow just to add a bit of warmth to our highlighting. And here we're going to be focusing this on the brighter part of the blade right here. Now we don't need to go all the way to pure hike yellow. That's probably a little too yellow. We just want to add a bit of that sort of yellow tone, yellow tint to the blade. Then we want to finish off with pure white. If you keep this color nice and thin, we can glaze this on and feather it down, getting a nice smooth transition in the brightest part of the blade. I'm going to do a few passes of this white to get a really nice sharp white highlight. Because of the way that he's holding the blade and the way that the blade curves, I'm actually not going to take this pure white all the way to this corner. I'm actually going to focus the pure white of the blade right here on this curve. And this way, when I bring the edge highlight up to the tip, you actually catch a bit of that sharpness on that corner right there. And it helps you reinforce how sharp that blade is. It's because our eyes catch that sort of subtle right edge highlight. Now, before I go in and do the edge highlights and then redefine the flat of the blade, I want to go in with some very thin glazes of my dark sea blue and maybe a touch of bearing blue as well. Nice and diluted, and we're just going to do some soft glazes near the bottom of the blade. Get over those mid-tones and shadows, and a couple of layers of this glaze, working our way down towards the pure deep blue, will actually go a way to help smooth out some of those rougher transitions and look like we blended this blade better than we actually did. So as we glaze into the deeper shadow, just use more and more deep blue. And then once we've done our glaze, we can go back in with pure deep blue. And we're just going to paint in the flat of the blade. Now make sure you've properly identified where it curves and how it ends. Some of these blades can be a little tricky in terms of, because it's not like a hyper-defined sharp edge, it's subtle. So you want to be very gentle in finding that edge and then just dragging your brush along. And then finally, we're going to finish off with some edge highlights. So at the brightest parts right here, we want to start with white. But as we fade down towards these lower parts of the blade, we actually want to switch to our Arctic blue and even Bering blue in some cases, depending on how bright or how dark you've highlighted the blade. Start with a little bit of Arctic blue here on the bottom. And I'm just using the edge of my brush to gently drag the paint across. Definitely want pure white at the top here. And then we want to put a highlight down right the divider between the flat and the cutting edge. So I'm going to start with my Arctic blue, starting from right about the midpoint. And I want to be as sharp as possible with the so I may have to actually switch my brush. Now there are a couple of runes engraved at the base of the blade, so we're just going to highlight those accordingly as well. And then when we get to the top curve of the blade, I'm going to switch over to my white. And then to finish off, add a few little spots and pings, make it look like the blade has a few nicks and cuts in it. So I'm going to take pure white, and we're going to add a few random dots to the divider in between the cutting edge and the flat, and then along the actual cutting edge itself. A few more glazes. With the blade done, we can now move on to painting the gold. And you can see that because we did the drybrushing of the bone and we made sure to catch some of that color onto all of the bone trim, or the gold trim rather, when we go start with our gold printed fur base wash, we have something to build that color on top of instead of having to go this on pure black. So we're going to base coat wash all of the trim elements with this gold printed fur. Be very neat about this, especially where it meets armor or sword. You don't want the wash to pool and wash over anything that isn't going to be gold. Make sure we get the little tabard clips here as well. So with the contrast wash applied, we can now begin to highlight the gold. And because most of this gold is bone detailing or bone-like detailing, we don't have to worry so much like the sword on doing perfect blends. What we're looking for is something that's representational of non-elemental gold, and we're focusing on our strong palette, we're leaning on that, and the high contrast between our shadows, our mids, and our brights. So we're using Resurrection Flush, Sahara Yellow, and Tenere Yellow, and we're doing no blending on this. We're just going to go straight through these three colors. Starting with our Resurrection Flush. Now this color is fairly diluted out of the pot, which is great because we can build up a couple of layers and not have to worry about heavy dilution. On flat areas where the bone sort of flattens out, we can just apply a bit more of this base color. And then as we get to the highlight edges, leave some of that contrast wash showing underneath. So I'm going to paint the shoulder plate and the forearm ramp just to show you what this actually looks like and how quick and easy it is to get some very convincing non-metal metal without too much effort. Remember, we're painting for the tabletop. This is going to be viewed from 4 or 5 feet away and not up close. And then from there, we're jumping straight into our Sahara Yellow. Going to highlight, leaving most of that Resurrection Flush showing. And we're focusing on the edges and the knots. And then we're going to apply our final highlight of Tenere Yellow. And it's at this stage as well that you can highlight the rivets on the armor. And that's how quick and easy it is. And if we pull back, right? If we're seeing this model from the tabletop, like look how good that looks. You can't even tell that it's just 3 simple colors, one after another with no blending. So to paint the orange elements, we're looking at the tabard, the binding on the sword, as well as on the Sashimono, the banner. We're going to be using scale colors African Shadow, Indian Shadow, and Kalahari Orange, with some glazes of Volupus Pink to bump the saturation and add a little bit of extra shading. Because this is a Hecatos and the Sashimono's meet red, I'm going to base coat this with my African Shadow as well. So I'm going to create a nice even base coat, especially on the bindings. Make sure that none of that primer or bone is shown. And to highlight the orange, we're just going through these two colors, the Indian Shadow and Kalahari Orange. I don't focus too much effort on blending the colors together, especially for the rank and file infantry. On the heroes, I may do a couple more progressive steps just to get a smoother blend. But the two colors are close enough together, for the most part, that a little bit of quick glazing and feathering is all I really need on the basic infantry. Remember that painting these tabletop models, it's all about that contrast. So make sure you're really pushing those values, jumping from your darks to mids to brights. Coupled with some bold colors in your color palette can make a model pop out with not too much effort. On the back of the tabard, I'll just do a quick highlight with a light glaze of the Indian Shadow, not to go too bright. And then for the straps on the bindings on the banner and the sword, it's the same color. We're just going to make sure that we paint each of the straps and be as neat as possible to leave the black lining. I'm calling the black lining, really, it's our base coat of African Shadow showing through in the recesses. And we'll go back in with some our contrast Volupus Pink. And we'll just gently glaze into our midtones and shadows, and you see it just adds a little bit of that warmth back in, pushes the saturation a little bit. For the Sashimono on the Hecatos, the majority or the dominant color is going to be that burnt red. I'm going to apply a base coat, feathering it down to the bottom, and if we need, wet blending a little bit with our African Shadow to get a nice smooth transition. Make sure we repeat on the other side as well as along the width of the back of the banner. Now, if I was painting a yellow banner, like on my generic rank and file infantry, I would be using Sahara yellow and Tener yellow for this. And just doing the same thing, base coating with the Sahara yellow and blending up to Tener yellow. For our final highlight, we're going to mix in some blood red, and we're going to focus just a slightly brighter highlight on the top. And we're going to pull it down about a third of the way. Once the banner is blended, it's time to paint the clan symbol or clan iconography. Now, what I'm going to be using is the diamond pattern of the Takeda clan. So it's going to be basically 4 diamonds stacked 1, 2, 1, and it's essentially a diamond quartered on the field. On the red banner, I'm going to be using white sands and white to do a ivory white color. If the banner was yellow, I would be painting it green using the Black Forest green, O'Reilly green, spring green mix of the armor. So to start, I'm going to use the white sands. I'm going to just use a couple of dots to determine where my symbol is going to be. So I want about just above half for the bottom corner. And that'll be my top and bottom. Finally, the approximate middle. And bring it out to either side in equal quantities. And connect. Once they're connected, I can fill in with the white sands. I'll do a couple of thin coats to make sure I get a nice even base coat. From there, I'm going to take my white and just apply a quick highlight to the top and fade it down. I'm doing a bit of a stippling to create this fade. Don't need to be super accurate with the blend because once we bisect it, the diamonds are going to be small enough you're not really going to notice. And then the stippling sort of helps to imply a bit of that stitching texture. So once we have the white painted in, we're going to take our red, so our blood red and burnt red mix, clean up the edges. Now remember that the acrylic paint will dry a little darker than it appears when you first apply it. So you want it to look a little brighter when the paint is wet, and then when it dries, it'll be fairly similar to the background. And then to bisect, we're just painting 2 thin lines from middle to middle on either side of the lens. And we can repeat that on the other side. In order to line up the diamonds approximate, we're just going to, again, use our white sands and just quickly eyeball the 2 top and bottom points. And that's pretty approximate to where it is vertically in the width. And then we fill and paint as we did on the other side. Now, we don't ever see both banners, or both halves of the banner at the same time, so really, as long as you're close enough to the approximate location, you're good. There are a couple of odds and ends on the base as well as the crow. And we're just going to be doing a nice, simple sort of black or blackberry recipe. I'm using rubber black and scale colors Hellbound Flesh. And all I'm really doing is base coating with the rubber black and then highlighting up by mixing in progressive amounts of that Hellbound Flesh to brighten it up. Now on the stones on the base, we're just going to be fairly rough, fairly sketchy, apply a bit of that surface texture. And we'll work our way as bright as we want. Probably brighter on the bird, not so bright on the base. Now, I intend to bury a lot of this stuff with the Vallejo modeling and texture putty, along with the tufts, so I'm not really going to worry too much about this vase here. I will, however, paint this rock. If you really did want to paint the vase, you could do it in the same non-metamod recipe as the rest of the gold trim. But I think this base has a lot of detail, a lot of color on there that's kind of counterintuitive to what I've already done for the rest of the army, which is fairly simple and fairly barren. So I want to keep this base as simple and as free of clutter as possible. I would have preferred to base this model on an empty flat base, but unfortunately the way it assembles, the feet are sculpted onto the base itself, and I didn't really feel like particularly carving those out. And we'll go ahead and we'll paint the bird in the same way. Rubber black and then highlighting the feathers while mixing in progressive amounts of Hellbound Flesh. And then using some reds and maybe some flesh tones like the Resurrection Flesh to paint the piece of meat in its mouth. And now with everything on our Bonereaper model painted, we can apply our texturing to the base. Again, I'll be using Vallejo Earth texture, and I'm using the brown earth color. And because this is an acrylic material, we can actually use a brush and we can use water to dilute it and apply it and push it around the base and really get it into those crevices and recesses. Now I'm going to work to cover up as much of the garbage on the base as I can. And we'll keep one or two of the stones that we've painted. But again, I want this base to be as simple as possible to really sell the narrative of the Desert Wasteland, and also because the models on top are quite complex, especially when you get to the stalkers and the heroes, and especially Catacrows. There's a lot going on, and I think having a simple base to contrast the complexity and the detail of the models on top is a really nice way to show off the models and to not overload the viewer with too much information. Having the simple bases really puts the focus on the models and not the base itself. Once the texture paste has fully dried, it takes maybe 1 or 2 hours. So not too long. If you do the bases in batch and work on something else in between, there's very little downtime. You can be pretty efficient with it. We're going to apply some tufts, and we're going to be using the Army Painter Winter Tufts, as well as some super glue, and then we'll just be using some tweezers to actually grip and apply the tufts. So the first thing we want to do is pick the tuft based on the size, and then just sort of dry fit or test the positioning I'm going to try and put one in the front just to hide some of this jank debris, and then don't have any small ones left. I'll put one in the back like so. So to apply, we're just going to put a drop of super glue, apply the tuft, and then just press down on the center and make sure that the tuft is fully adhering to the base. And then you want to make sure that you set this aside to dry. You don't want to be faffing around with any weathering powders or any varnish while the super glue is still wet. So before we apply our weathering powders, I want to brighten up the tufts a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use some Hikey Yellow, and I'm just going to lightly brush the tips of the tufts. And what this is going to do is just add a little bit of a highlight, sort of brighten up the tufts a little bit, but also making them feel a little bit more dead because we're using sort of this pale pastel yellow, pastel white kind of color. Don't need to go too heavy. We're just using a little bit of the color, and we're just gently painting on the tips. So be careful not to paint onto the actual model itself. And if you want to brighten up the tufts overall, go even brighter, you can start brushing down the side, get right to the base of the root, however bright you want to take it. And then we're going to use the tweezers, and we're just going to sort of pick away at some of these random strands of tufts that are just like sitting around. And so just shape it back up to a natural vertical position. The important thing is we're just picking off all the loose strands that are stuck to the base or sort of just scattered on the surface. And then we're going to go in with our weathering powders. So I'm using a dark red ochre from Vallejo Pigments. It's a very reddy orange, very bright color. And we're just going to liberally apply this over the base. So I'm focusing on making sure that the sand gets a really, really strong coating of this. I want to start shifting that color into that sandy red and away from the reddy orange. When I get to the actual model itself, I'll lightly brush it in between the bones of the feet and get some of that color up onto the feet itself. And then we'll also dust the base or the root of the tufts and get some of that color in there as well. Once that's done, we're going to take some mineral spirits and we're going to saturate the base. And what this is going to do is act as a fixer to help seal the pigments in before we paint the base trim black and varnish the model. So set the model aside again for another 45 minutes to an hour, let the mineral spirits fully evaporate and dry, and then once it's done, we can return and finish up the base. And with the mineral spirits fully evaporated, our weathering powders have set, and we can now finish off the model. We're going to paint the base trim with black, and then we're going to seal the model with a matte varnish spray. I'll be using Games Workshop's Purity Seal. It's an older product of theirs that's no longer in production. I believe it's now Minotaur spray, but it's essentially a matte finish. I think Mr. Hobby's Super Clear is a fairly close equivalent. And you can see that I've just taken a small base and I've blue tacked my Bone Reaper model on top so that I can have easy access to the side of the base without having to hold anything on the model. So we're just going to take some AK Black, dilute it nice and, well, not too watery. And we'll just do a couple of passes along the outside of the base to finish off our model. Be careful not to get any overpaint onto the top of the base, onto any of our ground texture. You're not going to be able to clean that up. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. And if you stuck it out to the end, I hope it gave you some insight into my approach to army painting and has given you some ideas or inspiration to speed up your painting to get your army models on the tabletop faster. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you give it a like and check out the other videos on my YouTube channel. You can also follow for awesome weekly content. And if you want to follow my other social media platforms, I'll make sure to have links in the video description below. As always, until next time, happy hobbying.